In this video, we'll focus on the stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination that older adults have to face, as well as how these affect older adults in various contexts. We'll discuss the paradox of being biased against your future self, since everybody ages, and why having a more optimistic outlook on getting old can benefit everyone, including you. But before getting to all of that, I'd like to take a moment to recognize several advantages to getting older. Research, for example, shows that older adults are happier. They report more ease and contentment just on a daily basis. They also have less anxiety and display anger less frequently. And also, older adults report relationships that are more supportive and less fraught with conflict. So there are advantages to getting older, but despite these advantages, older adults, as we've already said, are often the target of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Returning once again to the stereotype content model, for example, we see that elderly people are grouped together in the same cluster as PWDs, people with disabilities. This is in the top left-hand corner, cluster LCHW. If I recall correctly, older adults were ranked in competence all the way 19th place, but they were ranked in warmth 3rd place. So they're seen as relatively incompetent, but very warm. A follow-up study in 2005 found that older adults were rated as less competent than younger adults, but similar to younger adults in warmth and kindness. As a product of stereotypes regarding competence and warmth, as well as paternalistic prejudice, which, as you just saw, although I didn't mention it, this is the form of prejudice that elderly people tend to be targeted with, associated with feelings such as pity and sympathy. So because of these stereotypes and because of that type of prejudice, older adults frequently experience ageism, which refers to the negative attitudes, beliefs, feelings, and behavior toward people based on their age, and typically their old age. Now, I do want to note that young people can and are the target of ageism. For example, for every okay boomer, there's a spoiled millennial. I've heard that a lot over the years. However, the existing psychological literature has thus far focused on ageism against older adults, so that's where we'll focus on as well. But I do encourage you to think through how things might be similar or different for younger people. Now, what we see in the literature is that beliefs about older adults often reflect benevolent ageism, which is very similar to benevolent sexism in many ways, and the content of these beliefs typically goes something like this. Older adults are kind, but also in need of care, i.e. benevolent protection. Bugental and Heyman in 2007 referred to this as a weak but wonderful stereotype, and I think that's really appropriate and shows that sort of mixed ambivalent, right, slightly hostile, slightly benevolent sort of discrimination. As a final note, I'll mention that most ageism research examines, and I'll quote a 2003 article here because I think they put it nicely, what Caucasians think of other Caucasians. So it's a little bit unclear whether there are cross-cultural differences in beliefs about older adults. Some research suggests that people in collectivistic cultures hold their elders in higher esteem than do people from individualistic cultures, but other research has kind of shown the opposite pattern, and a lot of research has a few cross-cultural differences too, and we'll maybe talk a little bit more about that. Thinking again about intersectionality, we see gender differences in what Sontag, in a famous 1972 essay, called the double standard of aging, in which women are thought to age earlier than men, and that women face more negative consequences due to aging than men. In this essay, Sontag argued that getting older is more difficult for women because men's success is measured by what they do, whereas women's success is measured by how they look. Now, looking at the research, the evidence on this sort of argument is a little bit mixed. Some studies on aging do find gender differences, others do not. I'll tell you about one example that does, but keep this caveat in mind. In 2005, Kite and colleagues examined perceptions of women and men of different ages along 3 dimensions. First of all, there was a general evaluation. That's that first set of bars there. This is just like a good-bad evaluation. Also behavioral intentions. So this is like offers to help, proposed treatment for a hypothetical patient, things like that, and competence. They found that both older men and older women were evaluated more negatively than their younger counterparts, but the difference was somewhat larger for women. Similarly, there were larger differences between the treatment of older and younger women than in the treatment of older and younger men. However, for competence ratings, the pattern was reversed. Although both older men and older women were seen as less competent than younger people, the difference was larger for men. And as we saw when it came to the category women versus the subtypes of women, the global category elderly doesn't paint a full picture, and so we might be missing some important information if we rely on this global category as we do in the stereotype content model. Indeed, Mary Lee Humert and her colleagues in 2011 have identified a well-defined set of subtypes, some of which are positive and some of which are negative, of older adults. So let's take a look at this table here, which displays the negative subtypes and positive subtypes of older adults and the traits that are associated with each. So first we have the shrew or curmudgeon. This whole column here is going to be the negative subtypes and the traits associated with those subtypes. The shrew or curmudgeon, depending on the gender of the person, is sort of associated with traits such as being stubborn, demanding, inflexible, bitter, jealous of young people, things like that. Next, we have the despondent older person subtype, which is associated with traits like tired, lonely, neglected, depressed, sad, frustrated, things like that. Next, vulnerable, so afraid, worried, hypochondriac, always worried about being sick, poor driver, afraid of crime, sedentary, things like that. Then we have the severely impaired elderly person subtype, incompetent, senile, physically handicapped, feeble, slow-moving, slow-thinking. And the last negative subtype is the recluse, someone who's timid, dependent, forgetful, lives in the past, finds change difficult, things like that. But as I said, we have positive subtypes as well of elderly people. So first of all, we have the golden ager, someone who's seen as active, adventurous, alert, capable, healthy, sociable, independent, so not dependent on others. You can see a stark contrast with some of those negative subtypes and so on. We also have the perfect grandparent subtype, someone who's intelligent, knowledgeable, wise, kind, loving, generous, family-oriented, and likes to be around young people, as opposed to, for example, the shrew or curmudgeon, who's seen as being jealous of young people. Next, we have the John Wayne conservative, someone who's patriotic, political, retired, old-fashioned, nostalgic, religious, conservative, tough, doesn't like handouts. And the last positive category of elderly people, at least stereotypically, is the sage. And this is associated with traits such as being intelligent, interesting, very knowledgeable, concerned about the future rather than overly focused on the past, as the recluse is. But also tells stories about the past that are seen as interesting. So keep these subtypes in mind as we discuss ageism in two contexts. First of all, in the media, as we'll discuss here, and then at work. First of all, what we see in one 2004 study is that elderly people make up, at least at the time, 14% of the population, but only 3% of the characters on primetime TV, which is to say that they are underrepresented. Of that 3%, fewer than 10% occupy a major role, and they're disproportionately white. So we have a little bit of a, racial bias as well. And on TV, they're typically used in ads for medications and medical services rather than, for example, apparel ads. I will note that there are positives here. For example, when older adults do appear on TV, they're typically shown in positive roles, looking strong, active, and happy. Similarly, Daryl Miller and his colleagues in 2004 found that older adults were portrayed positively 78% of the time and negatively only 12% of the time. They also found that the most commonly depicted subtype was the adventurous golden ager, followed by the perfect grandparent, and what they called the productive golden ager. Only a small percentage of the commercials featured severely negative stereotypes or subtypes, such as the mildly impaired and the despondent subtypes. Age-based discrimination in the workplace as well is commonplace, despite legislation that makes this illegal. For example, older workers often endure ageist comments, such as being described as old and tired, being described as having a low energy level, or they just may hear comments such as, we need young blood around here. And when older adults lose their jobs, they often have difficulty securing a new one. And even when they are successful securing a new one, they often take a greater pay cut, a greater earnings loss than younger workers who are in the same situation. And things don't look too much better once an older employee is hired. Ann Ball and her colleagues in 2011 conducted a meta-analysis of the literature on age-related discrimination, and they found that older workers were rated lower than younger workers on selection outcomes, including ratings of job qualifications, hiring outcomes, and suitability for the position. Older adults also fared worse for advancement opportunities, such as the potential for development and promotion, and they were seen as having poorer interpersonal skills than their younger counterparts. On the positive side, and despite these biases, however, older workers were seen as more reliable than younger workers. And a great deal of evidence shows that these negative beliefs about older workers are inaccurate. As one example, one study demonstrated that older adults may actually be more productive than their younger counterparts, and it's been shown over and over again, for example, in a 2015 study that I'm referencing here, that older adults' knowledge and experience compensate for deficits such as reduced speed of information processing. Unfortunately, some older workers themselves hold these negative beliefs, and it's been shown that those who do are less likely to take advantage of learning and development opportunities, and they're less likely to report confidence about being able to learn new skills. Internalized negative stereotypes can then become sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. What do I mean by that? When older workers choose not to develop new skills because they think they can't, it reinforces the stereotype that they do not benefit from training and development, which in turn decreases the likelihood that managers will recommend other older workers for these opportunities. So it's a little bit of a negative cycle. Similarly, a 2013 study analyzed a huge data set from the longitudinal German aging study. After controlling for all sorts of things like participants' age, sex, education, and number of illnesses, they found that positive beliefs about aging led to more adaptive health strategies, which then actually led to better health, which is to say, better aging. Conversely, negative beliefs about aging led to fewer adaptive health strategies, which led to worse health. These people who had negative beliefs about aging aged worse. The picture painted by the psychological literature suggests at least two important findings. First, stereotypes about older adults are typically inaccurate, and second, those who hope to age well need to adopt a more optimistic outlook on aging themselves.